I've been reading Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. This is a book written by a man trained as a neurologist and a psychiatrist. He was really quite a remarkable man. At the age of 3, he decided to become a physician. And as a teenager, he took up a correspondence with Sigmund Freud because he was, quote, fascinated by philosophy, experimental psychology, and psychoanalysis. At some point, Freud actually submitted one of Frankl's manuscripts to a professional journal, which was incredible given that Frankl was still a teenager. Viktor Frankl was also a Jew living in Vienna, Austria in the 1930s. At first, his position as the head of neurology at Rothschild Hospital kept him and his family safe. But the Jewish hospital was closed by the National Socialist government. In the afterwords of Frankl's book, William Winslade writes, in 1942, the American consulate in Vienna informed him that he was eligible for a U.S. immigration visa. Although an escape from Austria would have enabled him to complete his book on logotherapy, he decided to let his visa lapse. He felt he should stay in Vienna for the sake of his aging parents. His family, mother, father, brother, and wife, and Dr. Frankl were arrested and taken to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, located in the modern-day Czech Republic. His entire family died. He survived, even though he was transferred to other concentration camps, including Auschwitz, even though he was told on one of his first days that there was a likelihood that he would be seen as too infirm and gassed. The book was his attempt to understand how, why, and when the concentration camp prisoners made meaning in spite of the inhuman conditions that they endured. As I read about what Frankl calls strange time experience, I was reminded of today. Now, don't get me wrong, as terrible as it is, I don't think that the COVID pandemic is on par with the Holocaust. My shelter-in-place experience has not had the poignancy of Anne Frank's. But there is a reason that both of these books, Viktor Frankl's and Anne Frank's, have sold millions of copies. Their messages are timeless, and there is a little something extra about the message for today. So, Frankl writes about strange time experience. He states, in camp, a small unit, a day, for example, filled with hourly tortures and fatigue, appeared endless. A larger time unit, perhaps a week, seemed to pass very quickly. Does this sound familiar to you? You see, I'm struck by the number of people who tell me how long their days are, whether because they are busier than any person has a right to be, or because they're not busy at all. I hear from both kinds of people who have these individual experiences, and I hear from these same people with amazement in their voices that it's already October. We have been in this COVID state for 6 months. Where has the time gone? I began to think about how people have compared the current political climate to that of the Nazi regime. And I began wondering about the depth of this book. The more I read, the more I thought, yeah, there are nuggets of gold here, especially for this time and place. Here are some of my findings from Viktor Frankl's book. Viktor Frankl writes about the various states of mind that the prisoners go through. He starts at the beginning and he describes how, as the Jewish people arrive at the concentration camps, they're not sure what will happen to them. Frankl writes, new arrivals usually knew nothing about the conditions at a camp. Those who had come back from other camps were obliged to keep silent, and from some camps no one had returned. On entering camp, a change took place in the minds of the men. With the end of uncertainty, there came the uncertainty of the end. It was impossible to see whether or when, if at all, this form of existence would end. When the virus first came on the scene in China, I remember wondering if it would be kind of like the Ebola virus, the stuff of nightmares, but really without a huge effect in the US. There have only been about 900 cases of Ebola, according to the CDC, in the US. As time passed, it became apparent that we would not be so lucky with the coronavirus. We were told that COVID-19 spread easily from person to person, but it was hard to know what that meant. Would I get it if I talked to my neighbor? What happened if I went to the grocery store and the person before me who had picked up the same box had it? And what about if I passed an infected jogger? Because a lot of them didn't wear masks. There were so many things that we didn't know at the beginning. I know I felt my anxiety raise. I felt the anxiety of my family and friends raise as well. And in my job as a chaplain at a hospital, I started noticing that my work was shifting from the patients at the hospital to the staff at the hospital. The uncertainty of how the disease was contracted was bad enough, but the staff were also trying to make decisions about treatment for people. Was it better to let the disease progress, like cancer? Was it better to let that progress so that the person wouldn't chance COVID? Or was it better to get the person as healthy as possible, as soon as possible, so they had a fighting chance against corona? On top of everything else, the staff fought the angst between wanting to do their jobs and fearing for their lives, and fearing for the lives of their loved ones. The uncertainty of the disease was horrid. And we were lucky in San Francisco that shelter in place had happened early and kept the numbers from creating a situation where the doctors had to decide who got treatment and who got left to die. As the staff began to get experience in treating COVID patients, the anxiety of what to do began to diminish. One RN told me, "I'm so glad I agreed to treat the COVID patients. Once I realized that I just had to do my job and follow the protocols like we do with any other patient, I realized I could do this, and I calmed down." However, as it was at the camp, with the end of the uncertainty, there came the uncertainty of the end. Now we have a much better handle on how it is transmitted, but we have no idea how long this is going to go on. Frankl moves on from the psychological changes that occur at the beginning of the concentration camp victims' incarceration. He explores what happens to the prisoners over time. I noted 3 truths that seem relevant to this time from this section of the book. There were many more. First, I was captivated by Frankl's description of choice of action. Frankl writes, "The experiences of camp life show that man does have a choice of action. There were enough examples, often of a heroic nature, which proved that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. We who lived in the concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Fairly shortly after shelter in place began, I signed up for the Kindness Pandemic on Facebook. It's chocked full of stories about people taking the time to be kind to their friends, their neighbors, and sometimes to total strangers. One of my favorites is about a person who had gone to a cemetery to clean up the graves of her loved ones. She noticed there was another person there who was first at one grave and then another and then another. The person didn't have any tools but was pulling weeds with his bare hands. She thought to herself, "Wow, this young man must have a lot of relatives here." It wasn't until she was preparing to leave and he was close by that she commented to him about how busy he had been. He sheepishly shrugged and said, "Yeah, I hope their families won't mind. I just can't stand it when the grass grows up so much that you can't read the name. It just seems so disrespectful." It dawned on the woman that this man was pulling weeds with his bare hands for complete strangers. The second gem that I found was about how one stays anchored to this time. Frankl writes, "The prisoner who had lost his faith let me try that again. The prisoner who has lost his faith in the future, his future, was doomed. With his loss of belief in the future, he also lost his spiritual hold. He let himself decline and became subject to mental and physical decay." The U.S. News and World Report related a story that from March 1st to April 25th, there were 87,000 excess deaths in the U.S. that were not attributed to COVID-19. Now, the article goes on to reveal that about half of those deaths actually were related to COVID in some way. However, that still leaves an increase of over 40,000 deaths. I must confess that when I read the quote from Frankl, I wondered if it explained this phenomenon in some way. Frankl tells a story of a fellow inmate who had a dream that he was allowed to ask any question and it would be answered. In the dream, the friend asked when the war would end and was told March 30th. Now, he had had this dream in February, but it was the beginning of March when he was telling Frankl about this. As Frankl writes, "Those who know how close the connection is between the state of mind of a man, his courage and hope or lack of them, and the state of immunity of his body, will understand that the sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect." Frankl believes that his friend's immunity declined, and thus the friend became infected with the typhus he had heretofore repelled. The friend died on March 30th. I think about this with those of our loved ones who have their minds set on the virus being gone by the time we celebrate the seasonal holidays in December. If we forget to project ourselves past that date, will we have a larger number of people leaving us at that time? The third gem I took from Dr. Frankl's writings about the concentration camp victims was about the search for meaning. In the book, Frankl is talking about how some of the prisoners would give up and want to commit suicide. And because there was a strict rule that if somebody attempted suicide, the other prisoners were not allowed to intervene, those incarcerated worked really hard to intercept people who had given up and might make an attempt. Frankl writes, "I remember two cases of would-be suicide which bore a striking similarity to each other. Both men had talked of their intentions to commit suicide. Both used the typical argument they had nothing more to expect from life. In both cases, it was a question of getting them to realize that life was still expecting something from them. Something in the future was expected of them." Later he writes, "A man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears toward a human being who affectionately waits for him, or to an unfinished work, will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence and will be able to bear almost any how." I've been wondering if this would be helpful to know for those who are expecting this COVID chaos to end in December or the new year. I've been wondering if this would help with those I've talked to at the hospital that have become suicidal because of the isolation and futility that they feel because of the sheer number of things that we face. Understanding this statement from Dr. Frankl seems imperative. It did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life, daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and mediation, but in right action and in right conduct. This week, after the debates, when the president said to the Proud Boys, and not the ones that are on Instagram today, the president said, "Step back and stand by." I listened to a Facebook live feed from a friend of mine. He was reacting to an Instagram post of a self-identified right-wing Proud Boy who stated that if Joe Biden won, the Proud Boys would bring war. My friend is visually seen as Black. He identifies as queer, trans, and two-spirited. He directed his comments directly to this Proud Boy, and basically my friend asked what this Instagram post was meant to do. He assumed that it was created to incite fear, but my friend explained that as a Black man, his life is at risk every single day that he steps foot outside his house. We beyond threats. Black people have been walking dead for a long time. We've been walking every day of our lives wondering if this was the day that would end it, because our lives have been devalued. So you making the reference that we should be moved and scared, come with it. My friend may have been angry. He didn't present that way. He presented as factual. He presented as a man talking to a bully and explaining why that bully's threats were no longer going to work. His choice of action was to stand up to a man who was threatening harm and say, "You do what you got to do, but I'm not backing down. I've had enough." Finally, Dr. Frankl also considered the psychological impact of being released from the concentration camp. He wrote about the remaining survivors sitting together in their hut after the first days of having secured their freedom. Frankl writes, "One of the men secretly asked another, 'Tell me, were you pleased today?' And the other replied, feeling ashamed as he did not know that we all felt similarly, 'Truthfully, no.' We had literally lost the ability to feel pleased and had to relearn it slowly." Assuming that these COVID times end, and I think that they will, I wonder if this story will ring true for us. What will we have to relearn? Will we have to remember how to ask for and receive hugs? Will we have to remember that there is pleasure in just sitting near people? And what about our young children? What will the impacts be for them? I think that we can learn from this book. I think we can learn from the past. And I think that listening deeply to each other, to the events that come forward in our lives and in the books that we read, will be instrumental in finding strategies for not only survival, but our success in creating a better future and a better world. Amen.